if you are thinking about whether or not to take a statin, you must consider this question: will I live longer and will I live better on that medication? And if the answer is no, I do not think there's a reason to take that medication. And I'm not sure how any physician or clinical provider or researcher would argue with that. Why would you take a drug which will not prolong your life and not allow you to live better, especially when there are other ways of improving your overall health? Well, you guys saved my life. This review from Sal M on bone marrow and liver and beef organs is amazing. I'm going to make a reel out of this and share Sal's story more widely. He says, I had the most wild experience of the last 10 months or so. I wanted to thank everyone at Heart and Soil, especially Paul and Zach, who was a really big help, and I'm really appreciative. I had a bad case of vasculitis that was supposed to be chronic. I was bound to a wheelchair for several weeks. I couldn't move my arms or legs. They had me on morphine for pain. I experienced a low GFR, kidney function, and gross hematuria and proteinuria. I was prescribed pharmaceutical medications indefinitely for kidney, rashes, joint conditions. It goes without saying, I'm very thankful I ran into your content. I was able to wean off all medication. I began an animal-based diet with the help of bone marrow and liver, lifeblood, and beef organs. I know it sounds crazy, but that's what happened. Not only that, I'm healthier than before I started on this journey. As I am off all medications, my kidney function is normal. When I go to vasculitis groups, they can't believe it. It's nothing but horror stories there. The people are on vegetable diets, which I tried for a few months with no success. They're on a cocktail of drugs like prednisone, dapsone, rituximab, etc. And in my experience, I was not able to get off of my medications until I completely cut out the vegetables. Anyway, I hope this is valuable to you. I made a video about this and my whole experience. Here's a video with the photos. I'll put a video link in the description of this podcast if you want to see Sal's story. Again, we're going to feature it on my Instagram and on Heart and Soil. But it's amazing that Sal, with an animal-based diet, our desiccated organs at Heart and Soil, helping him get some organs, was able to completely reverse this condition that Western medicine says is unfixable, and they would have just prescribed him medications for his whole life. This is what makes the work that I do feel like it's valuable to me, feel meaningful, and I'm so excited to share Sal's story. If you need more organs in your life, and I know many of you do, get them fresh. If you can't get them fresh, get them desiccated. Check us out at heartandsoil.co. Our mission through things like this, you heard about Zach. That's one of our health coaches who is available free at Heart and Soil to all of you. And our mission there is to help you reclaim your birthright to radical optimal health, heartandsoil.co. On this week's podcast, I wanted to dive into statins. There's been a lot written about statins recently. I get a lot of questions about statins. I get a lot of questions about LDL and cholesterol, which sometimes goes up when you eat more saturated fat and eat less polyunsaturated fat. Is that a problem? I talk about all of that in this podcast. I'm not going to give medical advice to any of you. I use myself as an example, how I think about this, the data that I have looked at. It's a technical podcast, but I hope it will be helpful to many of you. Please share with your families or friends if they are being recommended to take a statin by their primary provider. I know a lot of people on this journey end up in that chair in their doctor's office where that is the recommendation being given to them and they don't know what to do. No one wants to die from a heart attack. That's a scary thing for all of us, but I think there's a lot of nuance here and it is a complex thing to consider, but ultimately you will see in this podcast the decision that I and many others have arrived at. I think this is a really important thing to talk about, and it echoes the importance of considering where studies are funded by, what interests are at stake here, and how data can be manipulated to make drugs like statins look less harmful and better than they might really be. I'm not saying there are no benefits to pharmaceutical drugs, and I think there probably are some patients in whom statins are indicated. But I think that for most of you on an animal-based diet who are insulin sensitive and aware of your diet, that is something to consider very carefully. On to the podcast, guys. So I recently had another set of blood work done. I'm going to show you guys the results of that set of blood work. I'm going to show you my LDL, my lipids, and then I'm going to ask the question, should I be on a statin medication? Now, this is a podcast about statins. I wanted to go down some of these rabbit holes, talk about the history of statins, talk about LDL. I've talked about this in a lot of detail in the past, and I wanted to reiterate some of that, go down more of those rabbit holes, and really deepen these conversations because I think that statin drugs are one of the most controversial medications out there for good reason. They have a lot of serious side effects, but do they help humans? We'll talk about it in this podcast. But let's start with my blood work, my LDL, and we can begin the discussion there. Obviously, as always, this is not to be taken as medical advice. If you have, quote unquote, a elevated LDL particle count or milligrams per deciliter, or elevated ApoB, as I'll talk about in this podcast. This is a discussion between you and your doctor. All I can say is that I hope your doctor is open-minded. I hope your doctor sees context, as I will discuss in this podcast. And I hope that your doctor does not reflexively prescribe a statin without considering the context in which your LDL lies. And that is something where I differ from the mainstream very sharply. I recently heard a well-respected physician on a well-respected podcast essentially say that ApoB-containing particles, these are chylomicrons, LDL, and a few other different types of particles that are in your bloodstream, are causative of atherosclerosis. As I will discuss in this podcast, as I have discussed in many podcasts previously in more detail, I think that is not a statement that can be made by humans at this point, made by physicians at this point. We do not know that LDL is causative of atherosclerosis. Is an LDL molecule, a low-density lipoprotein, involved in the process of atherosclerosis? Yes, LDL appears to be involved. But is it a fireman that shows up to put out the fire? Is it the arsonist? Or is it another metaphoric identity altogether? I would say that I'll let you guys draw conclusions at the end of this podcast. You may also want to listen to other podcasts I've done on LDL and why I do not believe there is solid evidence to say that LDL and other ApoB-containing particles are actually causing atherosclerosis. So we'll get into that in one moment. But this well-respected physician on a well-respected podcast said essentially that he believes everyone should have an LDL of 20 to 30 milligrams per deciliter. He went on to say that you can't achieve this with diet because it's evolutionarily inconsistent and a little bit ludicrous in my belief, but you have to use medications like statins or PCSK9 inhibitors, which I'll talk about later in this podcast, to get there. And he believes this is the way to combat cardiovascular disease, because when you get to that level of LDL, you cannot develop atherosclerosis. The problem I have with this is, are we really taking a clear, honest, authentic look at the other problems when you get to that very low level of LDL? I don't think the Western medical system is doing that, but let's pause there. I want to show you my LDL, and we'll get into the questions of whether I should be on a statin. So you can see here, this is my LDL level from a more recent set of blood work that I got when I was in the United States. I will re-discuss this blood work in an upcoming podcast next week. This was from the 5th of August, so it's very recent. You can see that my total cholesterol is 254. My triglycerides are very low at 68. My HDL is 64. Essentially, there is a 1-to-1 ratio there. My VLDL is 11 milligrams per deciliter. My LDL is 179. And that is our jumping off point. If you are watching this video, you'll note that my ammonia is 55. That is a subject for a different podcast coming next week. Stay tuned for that. So if I went to a mainstream medical doctor with that level of LDL, I would venture to say that the majority of them would recommend a statin to me based on the zeitgeist, based on the mainstream understanding of lipids. That's why I'm doing this podcast, because I would not want to take a statin, nor do I think a statin would be the best medication for someone in my situation. If you guys have heard me talk about this before, you know that just looking at LDL myopically with blinders on is a major mistake that I think the majority of physicians in Western medicine are making. I'll get into that in this podcast. But the thing that is being left out is context. I am actually an insulin-sensitive individual. I'm an individual with a very high HDL relative to the general population, with a very low set of triglycerides. And would a statin be beneficial to me? Do we have data to address that question? We actually do from the 4S study, which I will show you in one moment. It's an earlier study on statins using simvastatin. But before I get into that, I wanted to show you this commentary on whether statins should be in the water and whether statins should be given at McDonald's. I thought this was pretty hilarious. So this is an article from the American Journal of Cardiology in 2010. The title is, "Can a Statin Neutralize the Cardiovascular Risk of Unhealthy Dietary Choices?" In this article, the authors say in the abstract, the risk reduction associated with the daily consumption of most statins, with the exception of pravastatin, is more powerful than the risk increase caused by the daily extra fat intake with a 7-ounce hamburger patty, a quarter pounder, copyright, with cheese and a small milkshake at McDonald's. In conclusions, statin therapy can neutralize the cardiovascular risk caused by harmful dietary choices. In other spheres of human activity, individuals choosing risky pursuits, motorcycling, smoking, and driving are advised or compelled to use measures to minimize the risk. Likewise, some individuals eat unhealthily. Should we be giving statins at McDonald's is what they say. At that point, fast food outlets already offer free condiments to supplement meals. A free statin-containing accompaniment would offer cardiovascular benefits, opposite to the effects of equally available salt, sugar, and high-fat condiments. I'm not a fan of McDonald's, and I certainly think the major problems with McDonald's are things like processed sugar, grains in the buns, seed oils, and other PFASs, perfluoroalkylated substances, which we know end up in their food because of the hoses and tubes and the processing of the food that they use. But should we be giving people a statin at McDonald's? The inference here is, should I get a statin with my daily pound or 3/4 of a pound of ground beef that I eat this morning? I went surfing this morning, and when I came back, I had for breakfast raw milk, which is full fat. I had raw egg yolks in there. I had some bananas. I had dates, and I had 3/4 of a pound of ground beef with raw butter. The authors of this paper would no doubt say that my cardiovascular risk is increased because of those fatty intakes, because they have saturated fat and they're raising my LDL. As you saw, my LDL is quote unquote high. It's definitely lower now than it was when I was ketogenic. And I believe it's lower now than it was earlier in my carnivore journey because I have carbohydrates in my diet, which helps somewhat, but it's much higher than what mainstream medicine would consider to be healthy. I'll talk later in this podcast about how those guidelines, how that goalpost of what is considered healthy for a human has been moved. But I don't think many physicians would look at my LDL and say, that's fine, because most physicians would miss the fact that I'm insulin sensitive. And most people would max statin me and say, you're eating all of this ground beef, you're eating all this grass-fed beef, I don't care if it's grass-fed, you actually need a statin. So this is actually a graphic you can see here, max statin, I'm neutralizing it. This is from that paper, it's a graphical abstract. No tablet can completely neutralize the harm to your individual health from eating unhealthily. Most cardiologists would say I do eat unhealthily because I have elevated levels of saturated fat in my diet. I would disagree with that strongly. Better ways to reduce your risk of heart attack, death from heart attack include eating healthily, exercising, maintaining a healthy weight, and not smoking. Well, I exercise. I was out in the sun for a while this morning surfing. I would say I eat the healthiest diet on the planet, an animal-based diet of organs, either fresh or desiccated from heart and soil supplements, meat, fruit, honey, and raw dairy. I have a very healthy weight, probably much healthier in terms of body mass index, much healthier in terms of muscle mass, much healthier in terms of body fat and visceral fat than most of the physicians that wrote this paper. So the irony is not lost on me. So one of the things I wanted to do for myself at the beginning of this podcast was do my atherosclerotic vascular disease cardiac risk. This is a 10-year risk calculator that I have shown here. And it says my 10-year risk of heart disease is 1.6%. This is as a 45-year-old male with a total cholesterol of 250, an HDL of 65, and a systolic and diastolic blood pressure of 110 and 70, respectively. I'm on no medications. I do not have diabetes, and I do not smoke. So if you use the 2013 calculator, heart risk calculator from the ACC and AHA guidelines, they would say, no, you don't need a statin, Paul. But I still think most doctors would put me on a statin. What I wanted to illustrate here was that if my profile stays the same as it is now, which I believe it will, I don't think that I'm going to change my diet. And I am a 65-year-old male, 20 years from now, 20 years of eating grass-fed, grass-finished beef, or organs like liver and heart and testicle, spleen, pancreas, kidney. I'm going to eat raw butter because it's good and nutrient rich. It has vitamin K. It has essential fatty acids. It has stearic acid. It has odd chain fatty acids. I'm going to keep eating fruit, organic when I can find it. I'm going to keep eating raw dairy. My LDL is going to be essentially the same when I'm 65. And if I redo this calculation with nothing else different in my life other than 20 years of this, my cardiovascular risk will become 9.9%, which is a 10-year risk of heart disease or stroke, which I think illustrates the flaw of this calculator. I'm going to be, presumably, I believe this is a reasonable statement to make, as metabolically healthy in 20 years of eating the exact same diet that I have now for the last 4 to 5 years with some adjustments in those years, obviously the addition of fruit, but my fasting insulin remains low, less than 3 micro-IU per ml. I'm going to be equally insulin sensitive in 20 years. I have many clients, people I've worked with, people that have shared their lives with me that have illustrated this. Why then is my cardiovascular risk now 9.9% of a 10-year prospective risk of heart disease or a stroke when I'm 65 versus 45? Because these calculators are flawed, and they're based on the fact that in population studies, age is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Bullshit. Age is not a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. As you age, there's nothing in your biology that says you should develop more cardiovascular disease, in my belief. I think that that is a bullshit statement, and that as you age, if you are insulin sensitive, your risk of cardiovascular disease stays the same, and it stays very, very low. Obviously, there are other types of cardiovascular disease that can occur. What I'm talking about now is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which is essentially atheroma, plaque in the arteries. So this is striking to me that with no changes to my diet, no changes to my insulin sensitivity, which I believe is clearly shown to be the major determinant of your risk of heart disease, I would have definitely been prescribed a statin. I would have been, arm wrestled, arm locked into a statin. I don't think any doctor would see me at 65 years old. And believe me, I'm very curious to see what I look like at 65 years old. I hope I'm still surfing those waves out there at 65. That's the plan. They would not let me out of the office. They might even call the statin police. Who knows? Maybe in 20 years, we'll have statin police. It'll be like Minority Report or something. And the statin police will arrive and they won't even let me leave the office without taking a statin. I hope we don't get to that dystopian reality. But let's go back to where I am right now and talk about the 4S study, which is essentially a very interesting study that shows that if you have high HDL and low triglycerides, there was zero benefit to giving people a statin, specifically simvastatin in this place, for primary prevention. I've never had a heart attack. That means I am in a state of primary prevention. If someone were to prescribe me a statin, and I know many of you, both men and women, are in this same boat. You're in your late 30s, early 40s, maybe you're in your mid 30s, maybe you're in your late 20s, and you eat an animal-based diet. You eat meat, you eat organs. You guys email me this all the time. I know what you're experiencing. You say, I feel the best I've ever felt. In fact, one of my friends who I surf with here in Costa Rica emailed me this question the other day. He said, I feel the best I've ever felt eating this way. He eats organs, meat, fruit, honey, and raw dairy. He's the leanest he's ever been. He's the strongest he's ever been. His serving is the best it's ever been, but he goes to his doctor. He has an elevated LDL. He's 33 years old and they want to put him on a statin. Why? Why? Because our doctors are not trained properly. This is something I've been talking about a lot. So let's look at the data here. Let's look at the 4S study. There's a subgroup analysis which clearly shows there is no benefit to putting someone like me, putting someone like my friend. Neither of us has had a heart attack. And I've had a coronary artery calcium scan a few years ago, which was 0. At that point, my LDL was over 500. That's an interesting anomaly that I've talked about on previous podcasts. But I had a, quote, elevated LDL akin to what I have now, 175, even up to 230, probably around 300 milligrams per deciliter, with a particle count above 2,000 nanomole per liter for years. Every single cardiac radiologist on the planet would say that after years and years, 3 to 4 or 5 years at this point of elevated ApoB counts like that, I should have atherosclerosis. I should have accumulation of calcium in my arteries. My CAC score was 0. Again, a CAC is not perfect. It only shows calcified plaque. I want to get a CT coronary angiogram in the future. I don't think it'll be any different. Nevertheless, it is a powerful tool to predict my risk. And it is a piece of data. It's not a perfect piece of data. We don't have many perfect pieces of data in medicine. But we do have studies. We do have literature. So here is the 4S subgroup analysis. This is the influence of low HDL cholesterol and elevated triglyceride on coronary heart disease events and response to simvastatin therapy in 4S. And you're saying, but that's the opposite of what you have, Paul. Exactly. That's the opposite. But there was a group in here that did not have this phenotype, that did not have low HDL and high triglycerides. They had low triglycerides and high HDL. What's confusing is that Dave Feldman has called elevated, quote unquote, LDL, low density lipoprotein, with elevated or high HDL and low triglycerides, the lipid triad. In this paper, they call low HDL and high triglycerides a triad of cardiovascular risk. So there's some confusing terminology here. Regardless, what you should focus on is this graphic here. You can see this is out to 66 months, the event-free survival by subgroups defined by baseline HDL and triglycerides. The event-free survival was significantly lower, meaning they had more negative events in lipid triad patients. These are patients with low HDL and high triglycerides. That is a marker for insulin resistance, though fasting insulin would be the best marker of that. Then in other treatment subgroups, and improved more with simvastatin in lipid triad subgroup, again, low HDL, high triglycerides, than subgroups with isolated LDL-C. So what they're saying there is when they gave people simvastatin, and you can see it on the graphic here, there was absolutely no discernible difference in outcomes if someone only had LDL elevation and did not have low HDL, high triglycerides, aka insulin resistance. If they had low triglycerides, high HDL, there was no difference when simvastatin was given to that patient. I cannot emphasize this point enough. I could basically end the podcast here, in my opinion, but I will go further down this rabbit hole. From this graphic, which you can see on YouTube if you're listening to this, but you can also find the paper. I just read the title. There was no difference out to 66 months of therapy with simvastatin when someone was not apparently insulin resistant, that is characterized by a low HDL, high triglyceride ratio. The simvastatin group and the placebo group were completely the same at that level. Simvastatin didn't make a difference. So why are doctors reflexively going to give you, your girlfriend, your wife, your brother, whatever, any one of us, a statin unless we are insulin resistant, unless you have low HDL and high triglycerides? Because this whole thing has gotten very convoluted, and because we've come to believe that ApoB containing particles, specifically VLDL, LDL, chylomicrons, are the causative agents of atherosclerosis. I think this is completely wrong, and I will question that now. So if LDL is causing atherosclerosis, then it sort of makes sense that in humans, we should get it as low as possible in all humans. Dave Feldman's group has a really interesting imaging study going on right now. There's no data from that study, but we will have data in the next few years. What they are doing is looking at coronary imaging, I believe by CT coronary angiography, of patients with quote unquote elevated LDL. Most of these people are lean mass hyperresponders, so they have very elevated LDLs while remaining insulin sensitive with high HDL, low triglycerides. This is Dave Feldman's lipid triad, not the lipid triad referenced in this 4S paper that I just mentioned in this podcast. But they're following them longitudinally to see if they will develop atherosclerosis. Most cardiac radiologists say they should because they have elevated LDL. We'll wait for the results of that trial. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. Mainstream Western medicine physicians believe that because LDL and other ApoB-containing particles are the causative agents of atherosclerosis, we should get this as low in as many people as possible. I've heard commentary from physicians saying they don't really have a problem with a carnivore or animal-based diet, but if someone on an animal-based diet has an elevated LDL, they should take a statin to lower that. This is essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that is true to the spirit of what physicians will say about this way of eating. But what if LDL is not causing atherosclerosis? What if something else is the first agent of atherosclerosis and LDL is getting wrapped into that process, perhaps even being brought there by the body to aid in repair of the vessel wall, which has been injured by something else? In that case, is it possible that in some situations, in people who are insulin resistant, the majority of the human population on the planet and in this country, that elevated LDL sometimes looks worse or sometimes associates with higher rates of cardiovascular disease? It's very possible that that is the actual situation that is going on, and we can see that. If you look at the Framingham study, much like this 4S study, but not involving statins, and you look at the relationship between LDL levels, low-density lipoprotein levels, and cardiovascular disease incidence, what you find is that if you do that as a whole group, and you don't give any sort of third variable to stratify or to break those people out into levels of insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity, as LDL increases, cardiovascular disease increases. This is the type of data that many who believe LDL and ApoB-containing particles are causative of atherosclerosis will point to. But they ignore the data that goes further into that analysis and breaks that same set of data from Framingham or other trials into subgroups by insulin sensitivity, whether you're using fasting insulin, whether you're using HDL to triglyceride ratio, whether you're using isolated HDL. What you find is if you break that Framingham data into 4 lines based on your HDL level, those who have the highest HDL, above 65 milligrams per deciliter, essentially show no relationship between levels of LDL and cardiovascular disease, while those with the lowest HDL show a very strong relationship. suggesting that there is a third variable at play, which I would say is clearly insulin resistance, aka sensitivity. So here's the question that must be answered by anyone who claims that ApoB is causative of atherosclerosis. If that is the case, why do we not see atherosclerosis, that is the formation of atheromas and plaques in the veins of our body, unless they are grafted into the arterial circulation? But in a native human, we do not see atherosclerosis in veins. We only see atherosclerosis in arteries. Why is that? Because something else is required for the beginning of atheroma, and that is damage to the endothelium, damage to the inside of the arterial wall, damage to the inner layer of blood vessels. And in veins are so much lower pressure, they do not have the damage from the higher pressure in the arterial system, which denudes, which scrapes off the endothelium in those arteries and leads to a lesion, which can become an atheromatous plaque or a fatty streak. This is the beginning of the process. Now, what causes the endothelium to get damaged? All of our arteries probably experience this, even in healthy individuals, at the bifurcations, at the sharp corners, where you turn the car real sharply, the tires screech. That creates turbulence. Even in healthy individuals, younger than myself or myself, I probably have some damage to my endothelial lining of my arteries at branch points, but the normal process of repair in my body, I believe, repairs those, and they do not become atheromas. I believe that in diabetics and those who are insulin resistant, and we know that these individuals have impaired immunity, have impaired wound healing. That's why diabetics get amputations of their toes, their feet, or their legs. We know they get retinopathies. We know they get all of these sequelae, side effects, long-term side effects of diabetes because they have impaired immunity and impaired wound healing. Isn't it likely they also have impaired wound healing in their arterial vascular tree? And that the damage to the endothelium, which probably is connected with insulin resistance directly, is the beginning event of atherosclerosis. And then LDL gets wrapped into that. And of course, if you have damaged endothelium, if you have a diabetic individual, could higher LDL be worse? Absolutely. Absolutely. Should we try and lower the LDL in that individual who has diabetes and we know has damaged endothelium, which is not healing properly? I would say that's reasonable. But let's also correct the root cause of their diabetes in the first place. You could give them a statin. I think that's reasonably indicated in Western medicine, especially if they're not going to change their diet. But how many cardiologists, how many physicians are really looking hard into the roots of that insulin resistance, the roots of that diabetes, and making the changes, whatever they believe them to be, whether it's a vegan diet, a Mediterranean diet, an animal-based diet, that would start to reverse the root cause of that diabetes? I don't think many physicians are, because we are not trained to think that way. And that is a tragedy that I think needs to be changed within our medical system. It's something I want to be a part of. But I strongly believe that individuals like myself, or perhaps you, if your fasting insulin is low, and this is not medical advice, if your fasting insulin is low, I don't think that LDL is in any way, shape, or form causative atherosclerosis. I think it is the fireman that shows up to put out the fire, not the arsonist. And I think there is no good evidence that ApoB directly injures the endothelium. If it did, why is that same amount of ApoB that is circulating in the human body not injuring our veins? Why don't we get atheromas in the veins? On previous podcasts, I've gone much further down this rabbit hole and talked about glycogen storage disease 1A, a condition with elevated levels of LDL with no elevation in rates of atherosclerosis. So if ApoB is causative of atherosclerosis, how can people with glycogen storage disease 1A not have higher rates of atherosclerosis when they have elevated levels of LDL? I've also talked about other conditions which are genetic. There's a monogenic form of insulin resistance known as Duchenne familial lipodystrophy, where people do not have elevated levels of LDL, but they are insulin resistant and they develop massive atherosclerosis. I've even talked about in previous podcasts chimp data, which shows that chimps have elevated levels of LDL, much higher than humans in the 200s, but they don't develop atheromas in their arteries the way that humans do, but their ApoB looks just like ours. They develop other types of heart disease, which are cardiomyopathy and heart failure, maybe related to captivity in zoos, but they do not develop atheromas in their arteries. Why then do we believe that LDL, that ApoB is causative of atherosclerosis? Is there any solid data really pointing, really indicting LDL and ApoB containing particles as directly injuring the endothelium? I believe there's not. And I believe this is where so many really smart and well-intentioned physicians are being myopic and missing the forest for the trees. This is a super important point. This is the whole point of this podcast. So let's dig deeper into statin drugs, what they do, why they're prescribed, side effects, evidence of benefits, evidence of risks, and go deeper down this rabbit hole. I've essentially given my overarching framing rant at this point, but I wanted to go further down this and give you guys more detailed evidence of what's going on here. So let's look at what statins do. Statins are HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. This is an enzyme in something called the mevalonate pathway, and it starts with acetyl-CoA. You see HMG-CoA here, goes to mevalonate. HMG-CoA reductase, statins do that. Now, downstream of mevalonate are a lot of intermediates with fancy names that I was never taught about in medical school. Isopentenyl, pyrophosphate, geranyl pyrophosphate, farnesyl pyrophosphate, squalene, and then a number of other steps to make cholesterol. It's important to note that cholesterol itself is a steroid molecule. It is a ring structure, not a fatty acid. Fatty acids in the form of triglycerides and cholesterol, a ring structure that is a precursor for the critical hormones in your body, are packaged into an LDL bus containing an ApoB particle, ApoB100 specifically, on the surface as a tag. It's a bus with a little tag on the window that says ApoB100. It has other apolipoproteins on it also that identifies it as an LDL particle. So statins interrupt that piece of human biochemistry. From the outset, we must ask ourselves, is that human piece of biochemistry important? Of course it is. There are other things made in the mevalonate pathway downstream from mevalonate that are critical for human health beyond cholesterol. But what I was taught about in medical school was just one, coenzyme Q10. I'll come back to that. The teaching that I got, both as a PA, a physician assistant in cardiology, in which I worked for 4 years before I went back to medical school at the University of Arizona, was if you give someone a statin and they get the major side effect, which is muscle aches, myalgias, just give them a coenzyme Q10 supplement. Well, what about all of the other things that are made downstream in the mevalonic pathway, like dolicol, which is critical for insulin receptor function because of these caveolae, these cholesterol-rich lipid rafts in cell membranes in which the insulin receptor sits? How do I supplement them with dolicol? What about isopentenyl pyrophosphate, something that is required for selenoproteins like glutathione peroxidase, like thyroidoxin reductase, critical proteins to manage the oxidative reductive state of the human body, and critical proteins involved in the conversion of vitamin K1 to vitamin K2. These are important things that have to do with our endothelial health as well. How can we ignore all of that when we give someone a statin? We can't fix that with just coenzyme Q10. If you're on a statin and you're taking coenzyme Q10, that's way ahead of what most people are. Where do you get coenzyme Q10 normally? Meat, organs, especially heart, is very rich in coenzyme Q10. So there are many downstream products of cholesterol synthesis in the mevalonate pathway. This is a different depiction of the mevalonate pathway that shows you these things that are ignored in Western medicine, but probably have critical roles in the human body. Let's look. Acetyl-CoA, HMG-CoA, mevalonate, HMG-CoA reductase, farnesyl pyrophosphate goes to ubiquinone, that is coenzyme Q10, dolicol, protein synthesis, and the brain also involved in the insulin receptor functioning in caveolae, which are certain parts of the cell membrane, cholesterol, and other important selenoprotein intermediates involving thyroidoxin reductase, glutathione peroxidase, the formation of vitamin K2 from K1. I'll show you more about that later in the podcast, but we are not taught about this in medical school. I was never taught to think about all of these critical downstream intermediates of a really important biochemical pathway. So more than anything with this podcast, with what I do in general, whether it's Instagram, Reels, TikTok, whatever, I want to teach you how to think for yourself. Many of you, if you're here, already know how to do that well. I want to challenge you to be curious about different things. Something that I was never challenged to think about in medical school that I've thought about a lot since medical school and residency was the human body has pretty elegant cascades of biochemistry, nutritional, biosynthesis. Are we really wise to go interrupting those with medications? Do we really want to do this? I would say no. do we really believe that a particle like LDL, low density lipoprotein, is actually killing humans when it has critical roles in the human body, which I'll show you in a moment, that are also not taught in medical school? I don't think so. I don't believe that the human body was designed broken. Yes, there are a small number of people who sadly suffer genetic polymorphisms in utero and are born with genetic defects and are born with genetic challenges. But the majority of us are not in that state. The majority of us are reasonably well outfitted genetically from a biochemical standpoint and are going to determine our individual health, longevity, and quality of life based on what we eat. When I was in medical school, when I was working as a PA, when I practiced in residency and after residency, I was never challenged to ask patients what they thought was causing their illness. But what we always do is we give patients this get out of jail free card that says, this is a genetic problem. I have a genetic predisposition to heart disease. I have a genetic predisposition to high cholesterol. I have a genetic predisposition to thyroid issues. I have a genetic predisposition to high blood pressure. Therefore, there's nothing I can do about this. When in fact, I think this is the greatest lie that is being told within Western medicine today. We are cheating our patients and ourselves and our families out of the possibility of changing our lives positively by making lifestyle changes. Unless we do research that is aimed at understanding what the optimal human diet is, and believe me, we're trying to get that research going with the Animal-Based Nutrition Research Foundation. You can find it at abnrf.org. We're working on a pilot study now with Stefan Van Vliet at Utah State University. Details are at abnrf.org. Unless we do that type of research, I don't think we will know how to equip physicians with dietary and nutritional recommendations. At this point, the best research is on the Mediterranean diet. So I'm fine with doctors recommending a Mediterranean diet. I don't think a Mediterranean diet is ideal for humans in any way, shape, or form, nor do I really think anyone knows what a Mediterranean diet is. If you look at the Diet Lyon Heart Study, it has some pretty impressive outcomes. I'll talk about absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction later in this podcast. But I think that the most profound thing about the Diet Lyon Heart Study was that it eliminated seed oils from the diet and replaced it with things like olive oils. You can make an argument that perhaps that is the most impactful thing that happened in the Diet Lyon Heart Study. As I've said before, I don't think olive oil is magical. I think animal fats that are rich in saturated fat that will raise your LDL, which I don't think is a problem, are the optimal fats for humans, the most sought out fats throughout our history. I'm a fan of stearic acid. I've talked about this in the past. I'm a fan of odd chain fatty acids. Those are found in animal fats, along with vitamin K2, et cetera. All of this to be discussed a little later in today's podcast. But why are we shunning those fats in favor of seed oils based on corrupt nutritional guidelines? Oh yeah, it's because 95% of people on the Dietary Guidelines Committee from 2020 to 2025 had industry ties and received research funding or were board members on multinational processed food corporations or were part of something called ILSI, the International Life Sciences Institute, which is a well-known processed food lobbying organization whose members include McDonald's, Pepsi, Kraft Foods, Dannon, Syngenta, Cargill, many others are in this group. Not the type of companies that you want influencing what policies are made in the United States guidelines. I don't think many of us actually eat according to the United States guidelines, but food lunches are designed around this, policy decisions are made around this, and it's heavily influenced by industry. The major contributors are things like ILSI, Dannon, pharmaceutical companies, but it's important to note that the Egg Board was on there, and way down the list in terms of funding, there are some meat interests on that. I don't think any of those people should be influencing policy for our guidelines, but the major contributors who seem to have the most sway in them are companies you do not want influencing what your kid gets at school. Hopefully most of your kids are getting school lunches that are packed at home. I've gone off track a little bit. I wanted to show you benefits of LDL. This is a slide that I borrowed from my friend Nadir Ali. LDL, VLDL, HDL, PCSK9 is something I'll talk about, the LDL receptor. These are all involved in host defense, the immune system, LPS binding, lipopolysaccharide binding, quorum sensing. When you lower your LDL, more lipopolysaccharide makes it into your bloodstream and triggers your immune system. They're also involved in reverse cholesterol transport, biliary cholesterol, so that you have bile to digest foods, and biliary cholesterol elimination. They're involved in cell repair, immune surveillance, modulation of inflammation, and cancer surveillance. Is this really a set of particles, especially the ApoB containing particles, LDL and VLDL, at least in this graphic that we truly believe are killing humans? I think there's something else going on here. More benefits of LDL. Receptor processing, lipid rafts, and caveoli for receptor functioning. I talked about that with regard to insulin. Hormones, yes. Your LDL is carrying precursors to your cells, which it uses to make all of the hormones that make you beautiful, handsome, sexual, vital, fertile, testosterone, estrogen, adrenal steroids, vitamin D. They are carriers for fat-soluble vitamins and antioxidants. These are the functions of LDL, VLDL, and other apolipoprotein B-containing particles. They seem like pretty important things to me, and yet why do so many physicians believe that we should get rid of them completely? I don't understand, because they believe LDL is causing atherosclerosis, and I think that is a grave oversight. I think that if we choose to get rid of LDL so strongly, we will suffer grave consequences. As I mentioned earlier, this respected physician suggested that we should have an LDL of 20 to 30 milligrams per deciliter. There are a couple of genetic conditions in which people do not make much LDL. These are specifically Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, which is an inborn error of cholesterol synthesis. It's autosomal recessive, and it is in the enzyme 7-dehydrocholesterol reductase produced by the DHCR7 genes. According to Wikipedia, which is a fairly accurate article, it causes a broad spectrum of effects ranging from mild intellectual disability and behavioral problems to lethal malformations. Oh, this is what happens when you don't make cholesterol in your body. You should all understand that the majority of the cholesterol made by your cells, the majority of cholesterol in your body is made by your body. Dietary cholesterol is a minimal contributor to your serum cholesterol. Most of the cholesterol in your body is made by your body. There are clearly receptor changes. There are clearly signaling changes when you eat less polyunsaturated fats and more saturated fats that increase your body's production of cholesterol. I would say that's a good thing. I want to make a shirt that says LDL of 250 milligrams per deciliter and proud of it. Celebrate that shit, you guys. That is more delivery of cell membrane components. That is more delivery of building blocks for hormones. That is more particles, more moieties able to participate in the immune response. Having a higher LDL, if you are insulin sensitive, is probably a very good thing. But kids with Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome have a lot of problems. And this is because they do not make enough cholesterol. How is it treated? A shitload of egg yolks. Then there's another condition which would probably be very titillating to the physicians that believe LDL is harmful for humans. It's called A-beta lipoproteinemia, a condition in which basically ApoB-containing particles do not exist. There is a mutation in the microsomal triglyceride transfer protein resulting in deficiencies of apolipoproteins B48 and B100, which are in chylomicrons and VLDL/LDL, et cetera, respectively. Now, what are the symptoms? Failure to thrive, stool, fatty stool with loss of vitamins there, frothy stools, foul-smelling stools, protruding abdomen, intellectual disability, developmental coordination disorder, ataxia, that is a gait disorder, muscle weakness, slurred speech, scoliosis. Of course, this is an extreme example of this, but this is an extreme example of what happens when you don't have LDL or cholesterol, respectively, with A-beta lipoproteinemia or Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome in your body. Not a good thing, guys. Not a good thing at all. Why would we want to do this? It doesn't make any sense to me. I do not think levels of 20 to 30 milligrams per deciliter will be without massive problems for human health. And perhaps if you get LDL that low, you will not develop atherosclerosis as a diabetic, but why not just correct the cause of your freaking diabetes? So here we are. Let's talk about statins. Let's talk about the history of statins, where they came from. We talked about what they do. How did they get here? And what's the deal? Basically, the diet hard hypothesis started in 1913 with a gentleman who fed herbivorous rabbits cholesterol and saw they got atherosclerosis. So since then, we've been obsessed with cholesterol, except rabbits aren't supposed to get cholesterol in their diet because they're herbivores, and the atheromas they had don't look like human atheromas at a histological level. And rabbits are not humans. And we know that if you feed humans pure cholesterol, they don't necessarily develop atheromas. This is what we use to treat Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome. But nevertheless, there's been a fascination with cholesterol, probably fueled by people like Ansel Keys and the like. And it has led to many problematic paradigms within Western medicine. In 1987, the first statin from Merck was approved. This is lovastatin, originally derived from a fungus. You may be familiar with red yeast rice or monocolin K, which is the substance found in red yeast rice. It's also found in oyster mushrooms and a few other things in nature. It is a mycotoxin. Lovastatin is a mycotoxin. It's in red yeast rice as a mycotoxin. It's there to kill the things that are eating it. It's there to dissuade the things that are eating it. Think about that the next time you eat oyster mushrooms. Cooking an oyster mushroom probably denatures the statin that's in there, the lovastatin, but that is a mycotoxin in mushrooms. This mirrors my perspective on plants. Why are you eating leaves and stems and roots and seeds that are full of defense chemicals when you could be eating the most sought after foods for humans on the planet? Organs, meat, fruit, honey, raw dairy, much less toxic. Why am I not a fan of mushrooms? This is the reason. Mycotoxins. Mushrooms clearly defend themselves against predation. Both red yeast rice, which is a fungus that grows on presumably a type of rice, and oyster mushrooms have monocolin K. This was the first statin to be patented by Merck in 1987. It's important to back up 7 years and realize that in 1980, Ronald Reagan slashed funding to the NIH for research, which paved the way for pharmaceuticals to fund much of the research that is done in the medical space today. This is something that I find lamentable. And I think that it influences the way that doctors are taught and the way that we conceive of things within medicine. The majority of studies that are done in medicine are funded by pharmaceutical companies. Is there a conflict of interest here? You bet there is. And as I will mention now, the problem with this is that often trials are not published and side effects are not discussed. So with regard to statins, this was unbelievable when I read about it. There is an organization that is headed by Sir Rory Collins of Oxford that has all of the raw data for all of the statin trials. And that raw data regarding side effects is not available to any third-party researchers who wish to examine the true rates of statin side effects. Don't believe me? This is a pretty incredible article from Marianne Damasi, Statin Wars, Have We Been Misled About the Evidence, a Narrative Review. Here she talks about a prominent researchers at Oxford University formed an alliance called the Cholesterol Treatment Trialists, CTT Collaborative. Sir Professor Rory Collins. This group of researchers began periodically publishing their own reviews of statin data from clinical trials. The reviews were dogmatic, according to Marianne Damasi's editorial, about advocating wider use of statins in healthy people, primary prevention, which we already talked about in this podcast, at least according to the 4S study. Not a lot of good data there. An accompanying editorial argued that everyone over 50 should be taking a statin, regardless of their cholesterol levels, and if implemented in the USA would lead to 64 million people, more than half of the US population over 35, starting statin therapy. One prominent cardiologist even wrote an article in Journal of American Cardiology. This is one we talked about earlier, saying that statins should be at McDonald's. Some doctors have even suggested grape-flavored chewable statins, which were offered by Pfizer a number of years ago for kids. And there was a debate about the USA putting statins in the water supply. But what do we do when the CTT collaboration does not allow anyone else to look at the data for statin side effects? Interestingly, as Marianne Damasi notes in this article, the CTT collaboration is a branch of the Clinical Trial Service Unit at Oxford, demands the principal investigators of the statin trials release the raw data on efficacy and side effects. There is growing unease that the CTSU has received over £260 million in research funding from the pharmaceutical industry, the vast majority of it from manufacturers of cholesterol-lowering drugs. They will not let third parties look at the side effects of statin drugs. What? Back to the history of statins. In 1990, there was an NIH panel convened to ask the question of whether lowering LDL in human physiology was a good thing. And their conclusion was, maybe it's not a good thing. Maybe we should be careful. Well, that was swept under the rug. And very few people know that in 2001, Bayer recalled a statin named Servastatin and has paid out over $1 billion to settle lawsuits related to serious side effects related to that statin from Bayer. A very interesting thing happened in 2004 in the medical research realm, and this was a scandal involving Vioxx. The pharmaceutical company behind Vioxx was found to be guilty of massaging data, of withholding data, and many thousands of people suffered cardiac and cerebrovascular events because this drug was not fully vetted and the negative side effects were hidden. After that time, increased regulations were placed on the way that trials are done, on the way that side effects are reported. And interestingly, as part of my research for this podcast, there is a real difference in the way that statin trials look in terms of outcomes before and after 2004. I'll show you guys a couple of graphics here in a moment, but what we find is that before 2004, statin trials made statins look like they were very effective for reducing cardiovascular disease. Statin trials after 2004 do not look nearly as impressive. And the problem with this is that when you look at statin efficacy in reducing cardiovascular disease or overall mortality, those are very important endpoints to consider, and they're different endpoints. We see that these meta-analyses will conglomerate all of the data over the last 30 years of statin trials. Well, as you'll see in a moment, data from after 2004 looks much less impressive than it did before 2004. But a meta-analysis pushes all of this together, and we lose the details amongst all of the numerous studies that are being considered. This is the problem. This is a nuance of a meta-analysis that must be considered carefully. Though it's a good type of study because it's looking at more data, it is also mixing trials potentially of varying qualities. And I think that what we have to be aware of at this point is that historically, with the massive change in the way that studies were done and the way that results were reported in that amount of time, we must be very skeptical of this. So this is an interesting paper. The title is Statins Stimulate Atherosclerosis and Heart Failure Pharmacological Mechanisms. It's from Expert Reviews of Clinical Pharmacology in 2015. The authors are here. The first author is Haruki Okuyama. But from this paper, I want to point your attention to this graphic. If you're not watching on YouTube, this is probably worth looking at. So you can see here on this graphic that the secondary prevention trials are in purple, dark blue, and the primary prevention trials are in light blue. It's important to note that this 4S line up here is a secondary prevention trial. This is in the people who had the lipid triad of low HDL, high triglycerides. Earlier in the podcast, I mentioned that in the people who did not have low HDL and high triglycerides, there was no significant benefit from adding simvastatin. And I overlaid my risk on that, which is important to consider that I'm a primary prevention and 4S was a secondary prevention trial. But the point I'm trying to make here is that originally in 4S, if you didn't have insulin resistance evidenced by low HDL and high triglycerides, there was no benefit to having a statin, even in secondary prevention. And if you look at this graphic, before 2004, the trials definitely showed a significant improvement in cardiovascular coronary artery event ratios for secondary prevention and even for primary prevention based on LDL levels. But this graphic, I will show you an erratum. There's an erratum for this graphic, which I will show you in a moment here. The after 2004 graphic looks like this. And you can see here that these lines do not slope down nearly as sharply as the lines from pre-2004. In fact, some of these lines even go up, meaning that when you lowered LDL in some of these trials, like the SEAS trial, like ENHANCE, which was looking at intimal medial thickness getting worse. This is GCHF, which was all-cause death as the outcome, which got worse when you lowered LDL. Some of these go up. There's Illuminate. So these lines are a very different slope, going many of them either slightly downward or even upward, depending on the primary endpoints, relative to the pre-2004 studies. What we must question here is whether or not there has been shady reporting of cardiac outcomes in statin trials before 2004 that changed significantly. And I think that if you are looking at data regarding cardiac outcomes, intimal medial thickness, or all-cause mortality for statin drugs or other drugs that lower LDL in that graphic, we must consider these either post-2004 or pre-2004 because we know there is a difference in the way these trials were done, the quality of the trials, the quality of the reporting, and throughout all of it, no third party can actually get statin side effects because that's at the CTT under the watchful eye of Professor Sir Knight Rory Collins. Interestingly, and along these same lines from the paper from Marianne Damasi called Statin Wars, she says that in the case of statins, the vast majority of trials are sponsored by the industry. As I mentioned, Ronald Reagan, 1980, et cetera, only one major non-industry funded study on statins has been done. It is the ALL-HAT trial, the antihypertensive and lipid-lowering treatment to prevent heart attack trial, acronym ALL-HAT, which showed pravastatin had no significant benefit in reducing either all-cause mortality or coronary heart disease in primary prevention. That is the only one that has not been sponsored by the industry. So is something shady afoot here? I think we must be wary of that possibility. In fact, I think there's a lot to make us quite suspicious of that at this point. I want to get to actual levels of statin side effects in a moment. I want to talk about the health protection study. But before I get there, I also wanted to talk about the cholesterol guidelines and how these have changed over the years. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I did a reel on Instagram a couple of weeks ago about conflicts of interest in the United States governmental dietary guidelines. And what I found reading a paper that my friend Andrew Huberman had sent me, hat tip to Andrew, was that 95% of people who made those guidelines had industry ties, as I mentioned earlier, ILC, et cetera. Well, what we find about cholesterol guidelines is very similar. So in 2000 and 2004, the National Cholesterol Education Panel revised the guidelines for cholesterol with no new data, but they lowered the level of LDL and total cholesterol that was felt to be acceptable and optimal with no new data, and many more people were then eligible for statins. It was later found that 8 of the 9 people on the NCEP, the National Cholesterol Education Panel, had financial ties to makers of statins. Bullshit. What the heck, you guys? What the heck? It's corrupt. How can it not be corrupt? Furthermore, if we're back to this paper from Marianne Damasi, she talks about the fact that shortly after the UK's National Institutes of Health and Care Excellence, called NICE, announced it planned to have the risk threshold for prescribing statins from 20% to 10% over 10 years, doctors vigorously objected to the change. A UK survey revealed that 2/3 of general practitioners would be disregarding the advice to offer statins to people at the newly proposed threshold of 10% on the grounds that it was not evidence-based, could lead to medicalization of healthy people at the cost of more needy, unwell patients. Skepticism was inevitable once it was revealed that 8 of the 12 on that panel as well had financial ties to manufacturers of cholesterol-lowering drugs. What? I think pharmaceuticals are amazing. They've done so much good for humans. And the industry is corrupt. The industry is focused on money, and we must be skeptical of this. They have benefits, but often the side effects are underplayed, and we are not told of important side effects, or studies are designed to minimize side effects. I've certainly prescribed medications in my life. I've taken medications in my life that have been helpful for me, but the pharmaceutical industry does not have a good track record, and it continues to look more and more shady the further down the rabbit hole you go. Consider this article from the British Medical Journal in 2004. Scandals have eroded US public's confidence in the drug industry. I hope so. I don't know if they really have, but in 2004, at least according to this article, only 13% of Americans believe that pharmaceutical companies were generally honest and trustworthy. That's 13% of people who are probably getting taken advantage of. But in this article, they talk about different scandals, different corruptions, different problems involved in conflicts of interest. Here, this is a scandal coming after a publication of a study from the center showing that authors of 13 of 163 articles published in leading US medical journals had failed to disclose relevant conflicts of interest. The list goes on and on, guys. This is not a new thing. This is not a striking thing. The pharmaceutical industry has many fingers and tentacles into lawmakers, and there are many conflicts of interest that are not being disclosed. Here's another slide from Nadir Ali. Hat tip to Nadir. This is all-cause mortality timeline in LDL clinical trials with statins and PCSK9 inhibitors, Fourier being the trial with PCSK9 inhibitor. Now, this is all-cause mortality. In statin trials, it's important to understand that sometimes they're reporting an endpoint of cardiovascular mortality, but what ultimately matters is all-cause mortality. I don't want to prescribe someone a statin if they die sooner or at the same time of something else. They may not die of cardiovascular disease, but if I'm just shifting what they die of, where is the benefit? And I certainly know that there are side effects. So what we really should be looking at in statin trials is all-cause mortality. It's pretty clear that in some statin trials, in many statin trials, and in many trials involving these cardiovascular medications, you can lower, at least in secondary prevention, these are people who have already had a heart attack, lower the risk of recurrent coronary events. But in many of the trials, what you'll find if you look closely is that the all-cause mortality doesn't really change. So this is Nadir's slide showing that after 2004, the all-cause mortality benefits in these trials went down massively. Could this also be related to changes in reporting and these researchers and the reporting being held more accountable? Look at this. The 4S trial, the subgroup of which I showed you earlier, had an LDL reduction of 25% and a mortality benefit of 3.3%. That was an absolute risk reduction in all-cause mortality from 4S trials. Now, as Nadir mentions here, 2004, Vioxx scandal, Merck agreed to pay $5 billion in damages for victims of this fraud. Lancet reports 88,000 patients had heart attacks and 38,000 died from Vioxx. New clinical trial guidelines, US Congress 2004, 2005. Look at the mortality benefits here. Ideal trial, 0.2%. Cards, ATOR, 1.5. Aspen ATOR, 0. Jupiter, 0.55%. Improve It, 0.1%. Fourier. The Fourier trial actually showed that when you reduce LDL, the mortality went up in that group. And I will show you, this is not a benefit. This is a worsening of mortality in the Fourier trial, which has been hailed because of how powerful PCSK9 inhibitors are at lowering LDL. But the mortality went up. So this is what I showed you guys in the previous graphic, looking at the multiple studies from 2004 and on and prior to 2004. Where has the mortality benefit gone? Where has the cardiovascular benefit gone? There's a real difference here when these researchers are held more accountable. It's something very striking. So I want to talk about the way that many statin trials are done that can minimize side effects. And a good example of this is the health protection study, which I will show you. This is the MRC BHF heart protection study of cholesterol lowering in simvastatin in 20,536 high-risk individuals, a randomized placebo-controlled trial. So this is from 2002. This is before 2004. And they found that adding simvastatin to existing treatments safely produces substantial additional benefits for a wide range of high-risk patients, et cetera, et cetera. And they found some cardiac benefit. But the annual excess risk of myopathy with this regimen was 0.01%. So the side effects were very low in this trial, which sounds good. If you listen to the pharmaceutical industry, what you will find is that the risk of myopathy, the risk of side effects is less than 1%. In fact, I know this because I myself was a featured speaker for Pfizer and Lipitor. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but when I was a physician assistant, I didn't know any better. It was early on in my medical journey, and I gave talks for Pfizer. I gave talks to other PAs about Lipitor and prescribing. And in those talks, Pfizer gave me slides. You can't modify them. You can't say anything that's not on the slides. It's very well controlled. Many physicians do this. We become handmaidens of the pharmaceutical industry. Like I said, I'm not proud of it, but it was part of my history. Now, if you compare what Pfizer told me to say and what they show in the data from the side effects of these statins to what I observed in my clinic, you will find very vastly different things. I would say at least 1 in 5 patients, around 30% of patients that I prescribed statins to as a good physician assistant in cardiology, quote unquote, got myalgias. Many of my patients had memory problems. Some of them had erectile dysfunction. Some of them had increased infections. There were all sorts of issues that people had with statins that I observed in the clinic. It's just my anecdote. I can't publish a trial on it. I can't hold Pfizer accountable, but many clinicians who have prescribed statins report similar rates of problems. 30%, 1 in 5 at least, of patients get myopathy with statin medications. And why would you not? They're going to impair the production of coenzyme Q10, which is critical for the mitochondrial electron transport chain. But how do companies like Pfizer or the makers of simvastatin come up with trials like the heart protection study that show rates that are so low? Well, in the case of the heart protection study and many other trials with statins, they have a run-in period. In the case of HPS, the heart protection study, they had a 6-week period where people took the statin before they even started the trial. And anyone who had side effects was out of the trial. Over 11,000 people, I believe, were excluded from the heart protection study because they developed side effects before the trial even started. The reporters of that study did not have to disclose that fact. They did not have to disclose the fact there was a run-in period in the reporting of the trial and that the results of the side effects may be greatly deflated. This to me is just pharmaceutical smoke and mirrors, shell games to minimize side effects. Ask a clinician who prescribes statins to patients, honestly, how many get side effects, and they will tell you a big number, much bigger than the pharmaceutical industry wants you to believe. Now, let's get into the actual side effects of statins. Many things have been noted. The most commonly reported thing is myalgias, which are muscle aches and muscle weakness. Very common. Guess what? You need coenzyme Q10 in your mitochondria for your muscles to function. There's no way around this. You can supplement with coenzyme Q10, but what about the dolichol? What about the isopentenyl pyrophosphate? What about the insulin receptors? What about the glutathione peroxidase? What about the thioredoxin reductase? You can't supplement with any of those things, or people are not being savvy enough to do that. All of those things could be very negative, which is why the authors of that one study that I showed you earlier suggested that perhaps statins could even worsen atherosclerosis. I'll show you that one at the end of this podcast one more time. With regard to dementia, there certainly are mechanisms by which statins could affect memory, and it's something that I have observed clinically. There is a difference between types of statins. Simvastatin, atorvastatin, which is Lipitor, and fluvastatin are felt to be lipophilic, things that statins are molecules that are more likely to perhaps cross the blood-brain barrier, whereas pravastatin and rosuvastatin, Crestor, are felt to be hydrophilic, water-soluble versus fat-soluble, and perhaps less likely to cross the blood-brain barrier. I would love to see an analysis of lipophilic statins versus hydrophilic statins with regard to dementia. I was unable to find any studies that show that difference. If anyone is aware of that study, please send it to me and I will share it in the next podcast. But if you look at data regarding statins and dementia or memory, at least large trials don't show that it's a problem, which is good, a little surprising mechanistically. Though some small trials that have gotten attention, this one only had 18 subjects, which is a pretty small number. 6 weeks withdrawal phase of statins, 6-week re-challenge. They found an improvement in cognition with discontinuation of statins and worsening with re-challenge. They say statins may adversely affect cognition in patients with dementia, but it's important to note that meta-analyses of observational studies doesn't show any effect on memory, and there is some signal that they may even have a neuroprotective effect. Statins do. I'm not a fan of them, but I'm just telling you what's in the data that we see. Again, I would love to see a different set of data looking at lipophilic versus hydrophilic statins. Is it possible that lipophilic statins are worse for dementia and memory, and hydrophilic statins don't affect memory in a negative way? It's also important to note that observational studies are consistently subject to healthy user bias. And is it possible that people on statins go to their doctors more and people on statins have healthier behaviors? It is possible. This is something to always consider when we're looking at observational trials. So what about osteoporosis? This is something else that's been discussed with regard to statins as a possible problem. I think statins or HMG-CoA reductase could have mechanisms in bones. So the diagnosis of osteoporosis in statin-treated patients is dose-dependent, according to this article from the Annals of Rheumatological Disease from 2019. Statin treatment was associated with an overrepresentation of diagnosed osteoporosis compared to controls in this generalized study population. This is all Austrians from 2006 to 2007. Diagnosis of osteoporosis in statin-treated patients is dose-dependent. Osteoporosis is underrepresented in low-dose statins and overrepresented in high-dose statin treatment. So is high dosing of statins causing impairment in bone remodeling? It's possible. And are other studies that don't show an influence of statins on osteoporosis just mixing these two outcomes? I think that when we're looking at statins, we need to be very careful, and the devil is in the details. Here is another study from 2017, which is before the previous study, showing the efficacy of statins for osteoporosis. And it actually shows may have a greater effect on male patients than on female patients, and it's a beneficial thing. The meta-analysis indicated that statin treatment may be associated with a decreased risk of overall fractures and hip fractures and increased bone mineral density at the total hip. Again, I think it's important to look at high dose versus low dose, and they do not appear to have done that in this study, so things get a little bit murky. Devil's in the details. One that many of you men may find close to home, the effect of statins on testosterone in men and women. This is a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials from 2013 from BMC Medicine. Statins may partially operate by lowering testosterone. Whether this is a detrimental side effect or a mode of action, Warren's investigation, why would you want to lower testosterone? Given the potential implications for drug development, prevention of non-communicable chronic diseases. The lowering of testosterone in the study was modest. It was not a lot. 0.66 nanomole per liter, which is not a whole lot. If you use a conversion tool like this, you'll see that that's only 19 nanograms per deciliter, but it's a significant finding in the trial. And is it worse in higher doses? Perhaps. 19 on your total testosterone isn't a huge deal, but is it affecting androgen receptor sensitivity? Is it affecting other metrics of androgen efficacy in humans? Who knows? Certainly there is also some, at least, signal for the possibility of erectile dysfunction in men. There's a case report here showing statin-induced testicular pain. Again, it's just one case report. Going back to this paper, we can see that among men with established cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular risk factors, statin use does not seem to be associated with new onset erectile dysfunction. If it's lowering testosterone and it's lowering coenzyme Q10 and making people perhaps have more susceptibility to oxidative stress by lowering glutathione peroxidase and thyroidoxin reductase, also lowering perhaps the conversion of K1 to K2 and worsening vascular health, then there's a lot of mechanisms by which it's possible. But in terms of studies, large studies have not shown a problem with regard to erectile dysfunction. Role of statins in erectile dysfunction, another one, Systemic Review and Meta-Analysis, 2014, the Asian Journal of Andrology. They say, however, it has been reported that statin therapy may reduce levels of testosterone and aggravate symptoms of ED. Therefore, larger, well-designed RCTs are needed to investigate the double-edged role of statins in the treatment of ED. I would say yes. The problem is that, again, the side effects for statin trials are held by the CTT and Knight, Sir, Professor Rory Collins, and they are not shared with third parties. So we really can't know what has been reported in the past in statin trials, pre-2004, post-2004. Mechanistically, there are some concerns about statins and erectile dysfunction. And why would there not be the precursors used to make testosterone, estrogen, and other sex hormones are from cholesterol? Yeah, so certainly doesn't look good for that, but this is just what the data shows. At this point, perhaps better studies are needed. What about with regard to diabetes? This is a very largely discussed issue. In the Women's Health Initiative, this is a randomized trial from 2012 in the Archives of Internal Medicine. You can see the conclusions. Statin medication use in postmenopausal women was associated with an increased risk of diabetes. This may be a medication class effect. Yeah, I think it might be. Further study by statin type and dose. Are we talking hydrophilic? Are we talking lipophilic? May reveal varying risk levels for new onset DM in this population. Why would statins worsen diabetes? Well, statins appear to be mitochondrial toxins. They do inhibit the formation of both heme A and coenzyme Q10, which are essential for the mitochondrial electron transport chain and cellular respiration. Mitochondrial problems lead to diabetes and insulin problems, insulin resistance. We also know that the inhibition of HMG-CoA reductase in the mevalonate pathway leads to decreased levels of dolicol that can negatively affect both the positioning and the actions of the insulin receptor in cell membranes in these calveoli. These are lipid raft, cholesterol-rich domains in cell membranes. So there certainly are mechanisms by which statins interrupting a crucial pathway in the biochemistry of humans could result in diabetes or worsen diabetes, which is ironic when you think about what we're trying to do, which is reverse atherosclerosis, which is a condition that is connected with insulin resistance. With regard to dementia and perhaps cognitive effects, there certainly are studies in animal models that suggest this may be an issue. I suspect we need better designed trials in humans to really answer this question. Simvastatin impairs hippocampal synaptic plasticity and cognitive function in mice. That's not good. Again, humans are not rabbits. Humans are not mice. We just need better studies here to really sort this all out. Now, I'm going to show an interesting study here looking at the progression of vascular calcification in the Veterans Affairs diabetes trial, which I found quite striking. So you'll see here from the title that the use of statins is associated with increased vascular calcification in the VADT. You can see that very clearly here in this graphic if you're looking on YouTube. This is the CAC progression. That is the coronary artery calcium scan progression. The CA score volume here at baseline in both statin and non-statin users. Follow-up progression consistently higher in those using statins. So what is going on here? They say in conclusion, in this cohort of type 2 diabetes patients with advanced atherosclerosis, we found that more frequent statin use was associated with an accelerated progression of coronary artery calcium score. Now, that doesn't sound good to me. The authors spin it in a positive light, saying that perhaps it was changing the composition of the plaques and pulling out certain non-calcified plaque, making more calcified plaque more stable. Nevertheless, I don't know how you can do any sort of hand-waving voodoo to say that worsening of a CAC score in patients in the VA system who took their statin more often is a good outcome. Nevertheless, that study exists, and you will not hear about it from Western medicine doctors. If your doctor is trying to prescribe you a statin, I would like you to show them that study and ask them if this is a concern for you. Perhaps you are not the same treatment individual as a population of diabetics in the VA who already have atherosclerosis and calcification of the arteries and positive CAC scores. But why would it worsen there? I think that there are some explanations in a paper I showed earlier. Mechanistically, this is the paper Statins Actually Stimulate Atherosclerosis and Heart Failure. They have some great graphics. We looked at this one earlier. This is a graphic looking at the mitochondrion and coenzyme Q10 and heme A. The fact that statins may be toxic to mitochondria. This could be a mechanism by which they worsen diabetes. Here is presumed factors leading to atherogenesis and heart failure. So we have decreased ATP generation as the final common pathway. We know that statin administration does decrease prenyl intermediates. This is isopentenyl pyrophosphate, heme CoA, heme A, coenzyme Q10, the selenoproteins that I spoke about earlier, and vitamin K2. You know that if you decrease vitamin K2, this matrix GLA protein formation is impaired and arterial calcification does accelerate. Selenoproteins do have involvement with peroxidative enzymes, glutathione peroxidase, thioredoxin reductase. Decreasing those could lead to worsening of oxidative stress and accelerated atherosclerosis or vascular calcification. So the mechanism by which statins affect selenium-containing proteins, and this goes back to the isopentenyl adenine groups, which are derived from prenyl intermediates, also in the mevalonate pathway. You can see here in this graphic, if you're watching the YouTube video, statins interrupt HMG-CoA, going to prenyl intermediates, which eventually goes to cholesterol. That is the mevalonate pathway. From the prenyl intermediates come the isopentenyl adenine derivatives, isopentenyl pyrophosphate, which are a key component of the tRNAs, these serine tRNAs that are involved in the formation of selenocysteine tRNAs and eventually incorporated into selenium-containing proteins. So at this point, it's important to remember how proteins get made. DNA is transcribed into RNA. RNA, specifically mRNA, is then translated into proteins. During the translation process of mRNA into proteins, tRNAs, transfer RNAs, connect codons, 3 base pair groupings on an mRNA fragment that code for specific amino acids. Those amino acids then become proteins. In this case, these selenocysteine tRNAs incorporate selenocysteine into selenium-containing proteins. That is how selenium, you say tomato, I say tomato, gets into proteins. Why are selenium-containing proteins important? Because, as I've mentioned earlier in this podcast, these include things like glutathione peroxidase, a key enzyme involved in the management of oxidation and reduction in the human body. Peroxidative stress increasing can lead to atherogenesis, carcinogenesis, aging. They're also involved in the formation of thioredoxin reductase, which is another enzyme involved in the management of the oxidative reductive balance in the human body, as well as selenoprotein P, potentially involved in insulin receptor signaling, insulin receptor processing, insulin receptor transduction, and iodothyronine deiodinase, a critical enzyme in the formation of T3, triiodothyronine from T4. So if you want your body to be able to balance oxidation and reduction, oxidative stress, to deal with DNA repair and DNA damage, to have an insulin receptor that works well, which you do if you want to be insulin sensitive, to have a T3 supply in the body that is healthy, derived from T4 at the level of the thyroid, you need selenium in your diet from animal foods, and you need selenium-containing proteins to be made, and these isopentenyl intermediates from the mevalonate pathway are critical for that process. So the hypothesis here is that, again, statins may interfere with this process and could potentially be worsening vascular calcification, as we saw in the Veterans Administration study, and as I'll show you in another study in a moment, through this mechanism of decreasing all of these enzymes. This I was never taught in medical school. I was never taught to think about all of these downstream effects of the mevalonate pathway when you give someone a statin. Are we truly making a full value judgment when we are prescribing these medications in medicine? That's a discussion between you and your physician. Later on in this paper, you can also see that the mechanism by which statins interrupt the formation of vitamin K2 is detailed. So vitamin K1 is found in plants. This is known as phyloquinone broadly. Vitamin K2 is generally found in animal foods. It is also found in natto, which is fermented soybeans. That's about the only place in the plant kingdom, quote unquote, that vitamin K2 is found. Vitamin K2 is a myriad collection of menaquinones, varying side lengths of the chains. Remember that these isopentenyl intermediates also are involved in the elongation of side chains on vitamin K1 to make vitamin K2 in the human body. Now, statins interrupt that process. As you can see here in the graphic, if you're watching on YouTube, this lower amount of vitamin K2 conversion could be a major problem with statins, and that could certainly lead to increased calcification in arteries, the thing that we're actually trying to fix with statins. Interestingly, in this paper, they also mention that this dihydro K1 is found in seed oils, and that could inhibit the formation of vitamin K2 as well. You'll see this arrow going from vitamin K1, the hydrogenation of oils, making dihydro vitamin K1, and that could inhibit the formation of vitamin K2 in the human body. Another mechanism that I hadn't even really thought about until I read this paper for why seed oils may be harmful for humans. So remember, seed oils are made from plants. Seed oils are probably going to have phyloquinone, a vitamin K1 in them, just like animal fats have vitamin K2 in them. Things like tallow or butter, egg yolks are good sources of vitamin K2, which is why I'm a fan of those fats. But vitamin K1 in plant foods, in seed oils, could be processed and make dihydrovitamin K1, and that could be a real problem. That could also inhibit the formation of vitamin K2 in the human body. Not having enough K2, we know from studies like the Rotterdam study, which is observational epidemiology, but if you can come up with any sort of confounding bias in that study, I'm open to hear it. It doesn't seem to be very confounded by either healthy user bias or unhealthy user bias. So I think it's a very valid observational correlation between the people that were eating the highest tertile of vitamin K2, meaning people that were eating the most vitamin K2 had the lowest rates of calcific aortic sclerosis, calcification of the aortic valve, and the lowest rates of cardiovascular disease. But where is vitamin K2 found? It's found in animal foods, which most of Western medicine believes are associated with worsening of atherosclerosis because it raises your LDL. That doesn't make any sense. Why would something that raises your LDL but gives you critical nutrients like vitamin K2, which we know are essential for management of calcification in our arteries and healthy arterial walls, contribute to atherosclerosis? It doesn't. Vitamin K2 is protective. It's that the problem here is that Western medicine can't see the forest for the trees. Most medical doctors are taught, as I was, that LDL going up is a bad thing, and they can't see it for the context that is most critical in this situation. You can see here in this paper, although not directly related to statins, dihydrovitamin K1 produced during partial hydrogenation of vegetable oils is not converted to vitamin K2, and its administration leads to tissue vitamin K2 deficiency, which might be associated with atherogenesis. Yet another reason to avoid seed oils especially seed oils that are heated or in any way, shape, or form partially hydrogenated. So with all of this in mind, as potential negative side effects to statins that are very rarely discussed with physicians, the trial from the VA, which showed worsening calcification in the arteries, isn't as surprising. It may explain some of those findings mechanistically. And this study also is not terribly surprising from a mechanistic standpoint. This is statin use in coronary artery plaque composition. The results from the International Multicenter Confirm Registry. It's from 2012, published in the journal Atherosclerosis. You can see here in the conclusions that statin use associated with an increased prevalence and extent of coronary plaques possessing calcium. The longitudinal effect of statins on coronary plaque composition warrants further investigation. You bet it does. Why would giving someone statins worsen calcification in plaques? Is it possibly because statins are actually inhibiting the body's ability to make any usable vitamin K2 and depleting your vitamin K2 status, along with other selenium-containing proteins, glutathione peroxidase, thioredoxin reductase? All of these are potentially very negative side effects to statins that need to be assayed if we're really going to have a full understanding of the risks and benefits of these medications. So where does this leave us with regard to statins? It leaves us in a bugaboo, I would say. It leaves us with a conundrum. These are very widely prescribed medications that make pharmaceutical companies billions of dollars when they're on patent, that are widely sold to physicians as something that could be considered to be given alongside a hamburger at McDonald's, given out at a barbecue with your friends. Certainly, if you come over to Carnivore MD's house for a barbecue, Western medicine might be excited about giving you statins at that barbecue, because I would serve you lots of meat and organs and butter and egg yolks. And certainly there would be saturated fat in those foods that would probably raise your LDL. I think you would leave my barbecue with more insulin sensitivity than you arrived with, or certainly no worsening of your insulin sensitivity. But Western medicine doesn't think about that. So we have widely prescribed, widely profitable drugs that Western medicine is a huge fan of because of their focus on LDL, that were originally created from mycotoxins. A mycotoxin, monocolin K from red yeast rice, oyster mushrooms, was the original derivation of a statin, for which there have been multiple recalls because statins have caused many people to suffer. Billions of dollars of lawsuits have been paid out by Bayer and others for drugs like Servastatin, and I think for which the side effects are widely downplayed because of run-in periods like we saw in the health protection study, and others, including side effects that are not even taught to physicians that we've talked about at length in this podcast, all to lower a molecule of LDL and other ApoB-containing particles that I do not believe there is any significant solid evidence are actually directly toxic to the endothelium and have benefits which are widely ignored by Western medicine in its practice and in its education, including immune benefits, etc., transportation of hormone intermediates, hormone precursors, cell membrane repair, all the things I talked about earlier in this podcast. So again, this podcast is not medical advice, but these are the reasons that I will not be taking a statin for my quote unquote elevated LDL in the 160s to 170s milligrams per deciliter, or 2000 plus nanomole per liter LDL particle count. If you saw my previous podcast on my blood work, you know that my LDL tends to be a very large buoyant particle, and I do not have a pattern B. I have a pattern A. I also have an elevated HDL and low triglycerides, and I'm very insulin sensitive with a low insulin. So I will not be taking a statin. And I think that we should be very careful in medicine in the prescribing of these. And we should educate physicians about how to correct the roots of atherosclerosis, which I believe are clearly found in insulin resistance, probably leading through multiple mechanisms to the progression of atherosclerosis, which certainly may involve the LDL moiety. But I do not believe there is any evidence, and I would love to debate anyone who believes there is on this, that LDL is directly injurious to the endothelial wall. I think is what we're all missing. And I want to wrap up this podcast with a couple of papers looking at the new assessment of risk reduction when statins are being used. So this is a paper, actually, Marianne Damasi is one of the articles evaluating the association between LDL, cholesterol reduction, and the relative and absolute effects of statin treatment. This is a systemic review and meta-analysis from March 14th, 2022. So it's from earlier this year in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Internal Medicine. And they find the results of this meta-analysis suggest that the absolute risk reductions of treatment with statins in terms of all-cause mortality, myocardial infarction, and stroke are modest compared with the relative risk reductions. Talked about that earlier. And the presence of significant heterogeneity reduces the certainty of the evidence. Remember that the trials from before 2004 and after 2004 find very significant differences in both cardiovascular benefits and overall mortality benefits when we're looking at absolute risk reductions. We can't look at relative risk reductions. A conclusive association between absolute reductions in LDL-C levels and individual clinical outcomes was not established. And these findings underscore the importance of discussing absolute risk reductions when making informed clinical decisions in individual patients. I'll read that again. A conclusive association between absolute reductions in LDL-C levels and individual clinical outcomes was not established. This is from 21 trials. This is published in JAMA Internal Medicine, suggesting some real questions when it comes to statin prescribing and LDL reduction in general. Consider this study as well. The effect of statins on average survival in randomized trials, an analysis of endpoint postponement. This is from BMJ Open 2015. The conclusion, statin treatment results in a surprisingly small average gain in overall survival within trials running time. For patients whose life expectancy is limited or who have adverse effects of treatment, withholding statin therapy should be considered. I think withholding statin therapy might be considered in most patients, especially if we can discuss with them how they might correct the underlying root cause of what is worsening their atherosclerosis, that being insulin resistance. And finally, this is from JAMA Internal Medicine in 2021, evaluation of time benefit of statins for the primary prevention of cardiovascular events in adults aged 50 to 75, meta-analysis. This is primary prevention, people who have not had a heart attack. These findings suggest that treating 100 adults aged 50 to 75 without known cardiovascular disease with a statin for 2.5 years prevented one major adverse cardiac event in one adult. Statins may help to prevent first major cardiac event in adults aged 50 to 75 years old if they have a life expectancy of at least 2.5 years. There is no evidence of a mortality benefit. No evidence of a mortality benefit. So basically what they're saying is you can trade one cardiac event for another event in your life, and you'll probably die at the same time. And over that amount of time, you'll have to contend with all the side effects that I mentioned earlier. Doesn't sound like a good deal to me at all. Now, remember that in the Fourier trial with PCSK9 inhibitors, there was a massive decline in LDL cholesterol. They got it down to 30 milligrams per deciliter here, the threshold that people say is magical and that cannot result in cardiovascular disease. Yet there still were cardiovascular disease deaths in this trial because it was a trial involving people who had had previous cardiovascular disease. And even at this incredibly low level of LDL, this massively miraculous finding, there was no mortality benefit in this trial if you were on PCSK9 inhibitors. A cardiovascular benefit, yes, but the people on the PCSK9 inhibitors with this incredibly low LDL died just as much as people on placebo at the same time. And in fact, there was a non-significant increase. More people in that arm involving PCSK9 inhibitors died than people in the placebo arm. I think the Fourier trial is a very important, interesting trial. And many cardiologists who are somewhat astute have come out and said that no mortality benefit with this much LDL lowering is not a positive trial. What are we celebrating in this trial when there was no mortality benefit with these drugs? So if you are thinking about whether or not to take a statin, you must consider this question: will I live longer and will I live better on that medication? And if the answer is no, I do not think there's a reason to take that medication. And I'm not sure how any physician or clinical provider or researcher would argue with that. Why would you take a drug which will not prolong your life and not allow you to live better, especially when there are other ways of improving your overall health? If you're listening to this podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube, you are someone that thinks about your health. Why would you take a statin when we know that dietary interventions like Diet Lyon, which is probably efficacious because it cut out seed oils from people's diets, is much more effective in terms of absolute risk reduction than taking a statin? And there are no side effects to improving the quality of your diet. There are no side effects to eating meat and organs, either fresh or desiccated, like we make at Heart and Soil Supplements, to eating fruit, honey, raw dairy. An animal-based diet is what I'm describing here. It's obviously what I'm a fan of and what I believe is most evolutionarily appropriate for humans. The only side effects of that are feeling well and crushing life. So I think that if you cut out processed sugar and you cut out seed oils from your diet, your insulin resistance will improve. And that is the driver of atherosclerosis. I would not take a statin. That is a discussion for you and your physician. But I think that all of this needs to get out there. And though this was a complicated podcast, I hope it was helpful for many of you.